From Bishop Ireton High School, it's Real World Wednesdays, a show featuring alumni and friends of the school for the Cardinal community and beyond. I'm Ryan Fannin, Associate Director of Advancement and a member of the BI class of 1989. And on the show today is Ken Baskette, a Bishop Ireton teaching and coaching legend who served at the school for more than 25 years. In Bishop Ireton's more than 60-year history, the school has had hundreds of teachers and coaches who have shared their talents with the students who have come through the school. Just 15 of those teachers, though, have been inducted into the Faculty Hall of Fame. As for coaches, an even smaller number, just 6, have earned a spot in the BI Athletic Hall of Fame. Just one of those appear in both, Ken Baskette, our guest on this episode. Add to that the Salesian Medal of Honor that he received, and Ken is one of the most influential people to come through the halls of Bishop Ireton. Long before he ever came to Cambridge Road, though, Ken had a fascinating early life and career that took him around the United States and around the world. He was born in Colorado and moved around with his family as his dad, a professor, had opportunities to teach around the country. Ken was an avid athlete and took a particular interest in baseball. After high school, he attended the University of Colorado at Boulder. He married his wife Judy just 1 year out of college in 1964 before joining the U.S. Navy as a communications officer on a destroyer for 2 years, and then as an officer in charge of a swift boat patrolling the coast of Vietnam. Ken received his MA in 1968 before beginning a career in government. That series of jobs in Colorado eventually led to a job in Washington, D.C., when he was appointed by President Jimmy Carter to be the federal co-chairman of the Four Corners Regional Commission. When President Carter lost his re-election in 1980, Ken considered a career in teaching. He began at Bishop Ireton in the early 1980s as a football coach and teacher. Over the years, he taught a number of different classes, but eventually focused on teaching AP U.S. Government and AP Human Geography. After coaching football and baseball for a number of years, Ken also began coaching the golf team, ultimately leading them to a Catholic state championship. Ken retired from teaching in 2007, but his dedication to the school didn't end there. He spent a few years working in the advancement office, worked closely with Father Matt Hilliard to establish the Bishop Ireton Athletic Hall of Fame, and was a longtime volunteer on the committee for the annual BI Golf Classic. So what exactly was it that helped Ken transition from government employee to renowned teacher and coach? To understand that, you have to go back to the very beginning, where his early life and interests ultimately formed the man he would become decades later.
Well, I had one sister, and we were both born in Alamosa, Colorado. But we weren't there very long. My father was a professor, and he started Adams State Teachers College in Alamosa. And then when I was a couple weeks old, got in a train to Syracuse, New York, and we were there for a year. And then went to Emory University in Georgia. And when I was about after the first grade, he had an assignment in Boulder at the University of Colorado, and he really liked it there, and they offered him a full-time job. So we got in the car, went back to Atlanta, and then moved. And I started in second grade in Boulder. So then I grew up there and went to high school, junior high and high school. But my dad also had a Fulbright grant, so when I was in 8th grade, we went to India for a year. And my sister and I ended up at a school up in the Himalayan mountains. And I didn't like it very much up there, but I liked it when we went back down where my folks were, and I got together with somebody, and I followed him around like I was a puppy. But he was coaching basketball, and I worshiped him. So anyway, so then we came back, and I did my 9th grade year in Boulder. And at that time, we had junior high that went through ninth grade. And so high school was only 3 years. So I started high school. There was only one high school in Boulder at the time, and I played sports. But in the winter, the University of Colorado baseball coach invited me to come work out with the university team in the winter, and that was fantastic. I mean, I listened to every word he said, more so than the players on it, especially the seniors probably heard it all before. And I learned so much about baseball. And there were a couple of interesting moments. One is there was a Olympic pole vaulter by the name of Reverend Bob Richards. I don't know if you ever heard of him. He was one of the first ones on a Wheatie box, and he was there for a Fellowship of Christian Athletes session. So I was invited to come in and listen, so I did, and then went back to practice, and he went up to the coach and he said, "You know, I used to pitch a little bit. Do you think I could throw some?" And so the coach said, "Ken, get in there and let him throw to you." First pitch was it seemed like 100 miles an hour right at my head. And I bailed out about 3 times and finally I thought, there's no way I can swing at anything he's throwing. So, but it was a fun experience. But I learned an awful lot about baseball. And then he told me, he said, "I really don't want you to play on the high school team," because the coach was one of his former players. And he said, "I don't think he knows what he's talking about." So I played summer baseball and then ran track for a couple of years. So, and then I played football and wrestled 1 year to get through chemistry. So that was really I just loved being around sports. And when I was in high school, I worked for what is now called Sports Information Director. And so I did all the football games. I'd pass out statistics at the end of each quarter and make sure they had hot dogs at halftime and all that. And I had a pass, and I could mainly sit there and watch the games. So it was great. And then I worked basketball games at the scorer's table. And I got to see Wilt Chamberlain play once.
Wow.
That was amazing. I was sitting at the table, and I looked up, and I saw a pair of knees, and I just started going, lifting my head. And oh, man, that guy is huge. But he was a great athlete. He also was on the track team at KU, and he won the high jump and the shot put. He's an amazing athlete for a big guy. But anyway.
So you loved your Colorado time.
I did.
It was a wonderful time in your life. And after high school, tell us a little bit about when you were deciding for college, how that came about, and then ultimately your college choice, and expand on that for us.
I kind of thought I wanted to play football in college or run track, and I knew I couldn't go to a big school, and so I had been in communications with Drake University, which is in Iowa, and they had showed some interest, mainly in track. They did have a football team, but it wasn't very good. But then I thought, no, and I didn't play baseball my freshman. I decided to go to Colorado, and I decided not to play baseball. Why, I don't know. Maybe I just burned out a little bit. But I missed it. So at the end of my freshman year, I went up to the coach and I said, "Do you think I could come out next year?" And he said, "Yeah, you can, but you're going to have to be on the freshman team." I said, "That's all right. That's all right." And then lo and behold, my father got a Fulbright grant to go to Burma. And my dad could take one family, one dependent, so he said, "Do you want to go?" And I'm thinking, well,
when am I going to go to Burma again?
So I said, yeah, sure. And I went to Rangoon and took a couple classes at Rangoon University. But I played on a local softball team. And I went up, they were playing, and I just went over to the field and I said, well, there was one team, I think it was sponsored by Pan Am Airways. A lot of people from the embassy, the Marines were on that team. And I said, "Do you need another player?" And they said, no, we were good. So I went over, and there was a team sponsored by the newspaper in Rangoon. They said, "Oh, we'd love to have you." And we played that team, and I think I had 3 or 4 hits. And after the game, they said, the Pan Am team came, "Well, we'd like to have you come over here." And I said, "Nope, I'm staying with this team." They're the ones that wanted me, so.
Oh, that's neat. Now tell us a little bit about what happened after you graduated from the University of Colorado. You obviously went back after your experience in Burma and finished up your time there at the University of Colorado, and then eventually made the move east in 1977. But tell us a little bit about that time in your life, Ken.
Well, when I graduated, I went to OCS at Newport in the Navy. So I spent a little over 3 years in the Navy. I was on a destroyer for 2 years. And then why I don't know, but I volunteered to go to Vietnam on a swift boat. And the swift boat's job was to patrol the coastline to keep contraband out. The contraband for them was a little junk boat carrying one hand grenade. I mean, it wasn't like they had tons and tons of cargo that they were trying to get in there. It was just little bits at a time. And that was a very interesting experience. And when that was over, I decided to get out. They'd said, well, we want you to go back and go to destroyer school. I said, look, and then if I go to destroyer school, I'll be back out at sea. So I was overseas for 7 months on a destroyer, 1 year in Vietnam, and I said, I got married, and I haven't spent 3 consecutive nights with my wife. So if you're not going to give me shore duty like you promised, I think I'll just get out. So I didn't know what to do, and I went to Illinois, where Judy's from, and interviewed at John Deere, and I was very impressed with the company, but I couldn't see myself in Ottumwa, Iowa, working. So I said, okay, I think I'll go back and go to graduate school, which I did. So I finished that. And I'm telling you, I've never seen such a dramatic change as when I graduated with a bachelor's, went in the Navy, came back, and it was 100% different.
In what way?
Well, there was a lot of anti-war protesters. I mean, I walked across campus the first day and saw a dorm room with a Viet Cong flag hanging out the window, and I thought, wow, what is going on here? So I just minded my own business and got my degree. And it turns out, and I stayed in the Navy Reserve, and the captain of the reserve unit was also the head of the administrative department for the state. And he said, if you don't have anything to do, we're starting a study here. And it will only be for a year, but would you like to be on the staff of that? And I said, sure, why not? It's a job. Because at the time I was thinking maybe of going to trying to teach at a junior college or someplace. And I couldn't go to a 4-year school because I didn't have a PhD. But I did that, and then when that was over, I went to work for the city of Denver for a few years. And then I got a call, and a guy from Grand Junction said, would you like to be the director of the Rural Development Commission? This was another state study looking at the causes of imbalanced growth in Colorado. It was one of the fastest growing states in the country, and yet half the counties were losing population. So I did that for a little over a year, and then when that was done, I got a job as assistant planning director for the state, and then moved up to the position of deputy director of the Department of Local Affairs, of which planning was a part. And then at the same time, the governor, who I knew, this was back at the time of the '76 Olympics, and he came out against it because there would be costs that we hadn't foreseen. And he was successful in getting it turned down, and he won the governorship. So then he asked me to be his alternate on something called the Four Corners Regional Commission. This started out as 4 states, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah, where they all have a meeting place at what's called Four Corners. And so I did that and got to meet a lot of people from the other states. And so when Jimmy Carter was elected president, the governors could pretty much pick who they wanted to be the federal partner. So that's how I was offered the job to come here as a presidential appointee. And that's how we got to Washington.
Wow. So Now you're on the East Coast. Tell us about that experience as this next...
Well, it didn't last long, obviously. 4 years was it. And the only thing I knew is what I didn't want to do. And I had actually gone out to Cal Poly San Luis Obispo and interviewed for a job there, and they offered me one, but only for a semester. And I said, I'm not moving my family for one semester. So I turned that down. And then I kept thinking, that's really what I'd like to do. I've always kind of thought about teaching and coaching and all that. And then all of a sudden it hit me. I said, well, why not high school? So I thought, well, I don't have a teaching certificate. But I actually went over to St. Stephen's, and I talked to the headmaster there, and he was very helpful. And he told me what I should be doing and everything. And then lo and behold, they had an opening here. And I came in and interviewed, and they hired me.
So what were your first impressions of Bishop Ireton at that time? What do you remember from maybe your first few months or first year here on Cambridge Road?
Well, I said I'd like to coach football, and I met the football coach, and he said, yeah, I'd love to have you. And we watched some film together of a good game they'd had against St. Albans, I think, and they were running the wing tee. And so I said, well, yeah, that's fine. So then they had a coaches camp up at the University of Delaware, and I went up for that, stayed in the Oblate House, and that was my first experience with that. And I thought, what am I getting myself into? These guys were pretty gruff, and I'd go down to breakfast and try to be friendly and talk to them. And one time I said, well, do you guys tend to root for Baltimore or Philadelphia teams? And he looked at me and said, well, it depends on whether you're from North or South Delaware. And I said, I didn't know Delaware was big enough to have a North and a South. So anyway, that was a good experience. I learned a lot and came back, and we went through the summer training, started a couple of weeks before school, and then I kept asking when I could. I said, well, what am I going to be teaching? Oh, well, you'll do this, world cultures, European history, and government, and we'd like you to be in charge of the UN. Okay, what about textbooks? Well, you pick whatever you want. I said, I have no idea. Certainly you must have a recommendation for what I should use. But it was all pretty, well, go figure it out. So anyway, I got through it. Man, I hadn't worked so hard in my life as I did that. And then I helped out with the wrestling team a little bit my freshman year, and then coached baseball with Norm Grimm, who was a legend. And of course, at that time, the Oblate House was pretty full. And then after my first year, they opened Paul VI, and there was the floodgates open, and a lot of them left. So there weren't very many left here. But a few of them I got to know pretty well. You remember Father Kowaleski, who came down from Judge High School in Philadelphia, and
drama department here, and sports, and he was just such a guy that he really loved the kids. He really got into. He was a big impact on a lot of us.
He was, and he was very good to me. We got along great, and. Then he wanted your mother to put on a school play with faculty members, and we did The Odd Couple. So I was involved in that, but Father Coe and a guy named
Bob
Valent were the two stars, and they did a magnificent job, and it was so much fun. And your mother was just a hoot to work for. She was great. And then we'd have a big party when it was all over at your house. And she was the hostess with the mostest. I mean, she was fantastic.
Oh, those were fun days. Now, I'm curious, Ken, about your perspective when the school became co-ed in the early 90s. The last year of all boys was the 89-90 academic year. And then tell us what it was like that 90-91 when St. Mary's Academy closed the doors, and now Ireton is co-ed starting in the 90-91 school year.
Right, and it was interesting. I was fine with it. And the first senior class, by then I was teaching almost all seniors. And some of my best students were the girls. And whereas before the boys would just shine. And I think they kind of, at least initially, they took a little bit of a back seat to the girls, which I found very interesting. But it soon turned out that all, the awards that were given out at graduation were being taken up mostly by girls.
Now, after some time at the school, you shifted into a role teaching AP Human Geography and AP US Government. What was it about these subjects that you gravitated towards?
Well, I would have been teaching AP Government from the beginning, but Gene Jasper was teaching AP History, and he thought it should be a 2-year course. So they didn't offer AP Government. I was teaching Honors Government. And finally, I don't remember what year, it was only a few years later, they finally said, well, the seniors shouldn't be denied AP Government also. So they made AP History strictly a 1-year course, and then I started teaching AP Government. And it was a natural. I mean, I had a degree in political science. I worked in the government at all levels, and I'd worked on campaigns. And so, I mean, it was very easy. I didn't really need a textbook. Here's what I know. And then I saw that the College Board was offering a new course called AP Human Geography, and I went in and said, you've got to let me teach that. Because when I was getting my master's degree, I wanted to get it in geography, and they said, no, you don't want that. What are you going to do with it? So I minored in geography, but I loved it. And so I went down to William & Mary and took a 2-week course down there on the class, how it was set up, and I loved it. It was one of the type of class that I could walk in and say, did you know? And the kids liked it. They worked hard. A lot of them that took AP Government also took Human Geography. And there was 1 year when I taught every senior. That was the year of the first renovations that were done, when the auditorium was built and some other things.
Yep, late 90s.
Yeah, and so Tim Hamer used to teach one class of American government, and he said he was too busy, so I taught 7 classes that year, every senior.
Let's talk a little bit about your time of coaching multiple teams. One of the things, and I can say this from personal experience, that whether someone had you as a teacher or not, you developed a lot of great relationships with the kids because you had an interest in really just opening up with your personality to everybody that wanted to engage, and you would engage them. And I remember this vividly about you, but being able to coach multiple sports was able to bond kids to be more connected to you. And you even hear this today where somebody will say, just go out and see your students, maybe just stop by and see a game or two, but you really live this in multiple sports, and it made you an incredible part of the community at a higher level than just teaching. Explain that dynamic from your perspective.
Well, I love football, but my first sport is baseball. And so my first year with Norm, he said, I'm retiring, but you're going to take over. And I said, okay. And so I had that. The second year, when I first started, Jim McGrath was here, and so he was one of the assistants, and a guy named Paul, somebody. Real nice guy. He'd gone to Virginia Tech, and he was a good friend of Norm and Eddie Grimm. And we had a good system going. And then I guess a couple years later, my budget was cut, and I didn't have any assistants. Now, try to coach baseball with no assistant coaches. And then I had to rely on the players. I said, I'm going to do infield, and I'd get one guy to say, you take care of the outfielders, but who's going to work with the pitchers and catchers? And it was ridiculous. And of course, practice areas were hard to come by. But I had some real good kids, and they gave everything they had. And this was one of the things I noticed about Ireton, and it was also my interest in a different kind of perspective on what a Hall of Fame should be. We were in a conference that was one of the best in the country, and we just didn't have the caliber of athletes that the other schools did. But the ones we had gave everything they gave everything they had. And so I really appreciated that. And a lot of them, being in a private school, didn't have, in the summertime, they didn't play on a summer team, like a Legion team. And I kept trying to encourage it, but they didn't feel like they could go to Springfield or Alexandria and get on one of those teams. So, but I want to tell you, the first day of practice with Norm, when the weather was bad, we'd practice in the gym. And you can only do so much in there. So the first spring day, beautiful day, and we went down to Simpson Field. And Norm said, you take care of batting practice. I'm going to work with the pitchers and catchers. I said, great. So this is the traditional way of doing batting practice. I said, okay, first up, I want you to get 5 hits, bunt 1, and run to third. First guy up eventually got 5 hits, laid one down eventually, and ran straight to third. And I thought, oh, my God. I said, what I meant is you run first, second, and third. And anyway, and I remember when we'd have batting practice, I'd keep trying to jump back in line. They said, get out of here, you've already had your swings. And I said, just one more. So it was a beautiful day. Nobody wanted to hit anymore. And so I said, I went over, we had one wooden bat, and I went and got the bat, and I said, I'm going to hit. And Norm Grimm was just standing there with this big grin on his face, and I was hitting the ball. I mean, I was crushing it. And they'd say, come on, we got to go. And I said, just one more. And he started laughing. He said, Coach, we got to go.
Oh, the competitor in you always there.
So anyway, I thought, man, I'm in for a long haul here.
Football, baseball, tell us about golf and anything else you got involved in.
Okay.
Too. You were a state champion golf coach here.
Yeah, and when I first started coaching golf, I didn't have anybody. So I'd go out on the first tee, and I'd take an iron, and I'd hit it, and I'd say, anybody can hit past that, you're on the team.
There's the tryouts.
But I'd have one kid maybe that could play a little bit, and then finally, and I attribute all this to Tiger Woods, it became popular. And then I started getting some good kids. And my favorite story about golf was not the state championship. It was when we played DeMatha in Maryland, and we beat them. I mean, it wasn't even close. It was something like
6-3, 7-2.
6-3, yeah, it was. And so their coach came up to me and he said, "Can I talk to your boys a minute?" And I said, "Okay." And he went over and he said, "I just want to congratulate you. That's the first time we've lost a dual match in 10 years.
Wow. Now tell us about the vision of you and Matt Hilliard and others to say Ireton has got a lot of history in sports over the years, from many different years, starting when the school opened back in 1964, and we have not had an athletic Hall of Fame yet. And you were determined to have that come to fruition. Tell us how that happened, because now that has a rich history, and we have another athletic Hall of Fame class being inducted on Thursday, October 2nd.
Yeah, that was interesting. I after I retired from teaching, I came back as a contract employee and worked part-time in the development office. And I'd always had this in the back of my mind, but, I wanted to do something productive. And so I talked to the development director, and he said, yeah, go for it. So I called around and asked other schools how they did it and all that. And then I did research, primarily with the Washington Post, to find out as many all-Met teams as I could. And I went through every one of them and trying to find somebody from Ireton. And then I had a little bit of luck with the Alexandria papers, who used to do pretty good coverage. And so anyway, based on, and then recommendations by people, and we came up with the first class, which was pretty good. And, you know, the first few were pretty easy. But there were certain sports where we had a lot of good athletes, like there's swimming and wrestling. I thought it was time these kids got some recognition.
A lot of great athletes over the years. And around that time, you had a tremendous amount of years of coaching and teaching at Ireton. And what was your decision in 06, 07 for it to be your final year teaching? Because I'm sure that had to be a tough decision for you.
It was. And it's one of those things where if we'd have had a block schedule and I could teach one class, I probably would have tried to do that. But I thought it was time to leave. And I have to say that they were the best years of my life. I mean, I loved it here. And the other thing that is always a kind of a joke is that I was one of the token non-Catholics here. So they'd call me Catholic Light and everything. But I probably appreciated the Salesian philosophy more so than other people here. I was really taken by it. And when Father Matt was principal, I'd go in and talk to him. And if I had a question about something, I'd say, "What the heck's going on with this?" And then he'd laugh and he'd try to be patient with me and explain it.
Well, I want to bring this full circle now, Ken. It's 2025, and now you have a granddaughter that has just started here at Bishop Ireton as a freshman. So the legacy continues for you and your family. Tell us this story.
She's the only grandchild we have, and fortunately she lives here. I tried to initially get her interested in golf, and I think part of the problem was that there were a lot of boys and not many girls, and she didn't care for that. But, you know, she could play a little bit, and she and I'd pair up against her mom and dad and play for ice cream, which we always won. But then she got into ice hockey, and she's kind of little and everything, and a little timid, but then the longer she was with it, the tougher she got, the more aggressive she got. And I don't even know how many years she's been with the Ice Dogs, but it's been a lot. And then when Ireton decided to have a girls' team this year.
First time ever. Very exciting.
That sold it for her. And she said she wanted to come here. And then, you know, in the meantime, she'd played lacrosse, and she was just involved, and she did rock climbing and everything. But so I talked to her when she was thinking about coming here, and I said, "Well, have you thought about sports besides hockey and lacrosse?" And she said, "Yeah, I want to play field hockey, and I want to swim, play ice hockey and lacrosse." And I said, you can't do 4. I said, "What are you going to do when it's swim time?" I said, "These are kids that swim year-round, not in the summer."
Sounds like the competitor that her grandfather is. I hear a theme. I see a theme coming out here. Ken, I've often remarked as an alumnus of the school who now works here that Bishop Ireton is both familiar and different. And I've always felt the Cardinal spirit coursing through this school. But of course, we've seen amazing expansions, including the building where we're taping the interview here today of Real World Wednesday, 41,000 square foot building here, which opened in 2020, and top to bottom renovation of the St. Francis de Sales Chapel earlier this year in 2025. And so now that you're a grandparent of a student, what are your feelings about the school now?
I'm just in awe of what's happened here. I mean, it's such a transformation. It's hard to believe. A lot of credit goes to the head of school, and she's just done an amazing job. And such a great attitude, I think, also. But, I mean, walking in here today, I would have gotten lost if I hadn't been with you. I couldn't believe it. And I was here before, after the renovation, but there's been a lot done since then. If you told me to go find a classroom, I don't know if I could do it.
You know, what's neat, too, is that I've heard somebody say they went back to their old high school and they didn't recognize it at all, but Ireton has a nice in-between because so much of the old portion of the school, it's still, you walk down the hall and you feel like you're back in the 80s. And the way Bishop Ireton and the letters across in the front of the school. it is a nice mix, isn't it?
It is.
Which is so important for tradition.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. And I think that I told Claire, my granddaughter, I said, you want to make sure that if they do any Salesian teaching, pay attention. I said, that's good stuff. And so I hope they still have a little bit of that here. I know that there aren't any oblates, but...
They keeping Salesian spirituality at the forefront of every day here.
Okay, good.
It's going extremely strong still. And as you mentioned, head of school, Kathleen McDutt makes sure that that's such a huge priority for the community. And a couple other things I want to ask you about as we come down the stretch of what's been just such a great chance to sit down with an Ireton legend yourself. And speaking of that, you and I have been friends for a long time, so I like to brag about you because you will never brag about yourself. But you are the only person in Bishop Ireton history who is a member of the Faculty Hall of Fame, the Athletic Hall of Fame, and a Salesian Medal recipient. What does that mean to you, Ken?
Well, it means a lot. And maybe foremost is the Salesian Medal. I mean, that blew me away when Father Matt gave me that.
Tell us about advice that you would give students. Now, you've shared some things that you've talked about with your granddaughter, Claire, but for students to have the full Cardinal experience, if they came up to you and I asked you the question as if I was one of the students here today, what advice would you give to be able to have that maximum experience you can have during your 4 years on Cambridge Road?
Just do as much as you can do. Have a full plate. Don't be a bystander, be a participant. And if you can't do anything, go out and support the teams, the plays, the music, whatever, But don't just be a wallflower. You're missing out too much if you do that. You got to get involved.
That's Ken Baskette, a legendary coach and teacher who remains strongly connected to the Bishop Ireton community to this day. I'm Ryan Fannin, and you've been listening to Bishop Ireton's Real World Wednesdays.